The cops rolled up my gravel driveway like it was a hostage situation. Sirens. Lights. One of them even crouched behind his cruiser door like my cows were armed. "Sir, we got a call about livestock running loose," the officer said, hand resting on his holster. I leaned against my fence, arms crossed. They moved 3 feet past the property stake. 3 feet. From behind the cop's shoulder, there she was, Perla Zimmerman, president of the Broken Maple Estates HOA, blonde bob bouncing, clipboard in hand like she was issuing a presidential order. "They were grazing on community green space," Perla said, lips pursed so tight it looked painful. "It's in violation of Article 7, Section 4 of the HOA Covenant." I gestured to the bright orange flags marking my land boundary. "That green space is mine. Surveyor confirmed it last month." "You've got the report." Perla held up her clipboard like it proved something. "I've reviewed the documents, Quentin. The board agrees that the boundary is unclear." I laughed once. "Funny. It was clear enough when you tried to fine me last month for putting up a barn on my own property." The officer looked between us, clearly annoyed. "Ma'am, did you say the cows were aggressive?" "They were menacing," Perla snapped. One of them looked directly at me. The cop gave me a look that said he knew this was a waste of time. "Just make sure they don't cross the line again, all right." "Sure," I said, tipping my hat. Maybe Perla should stop trespassing on my land if she's scared of cows. Perla turned on her heel and stormed off, heels clicking down the gravel like she was marching into battle. I thought it was over. Until the next day. I got home from work mechanic's shop in town and found a bright red HOA violation notice duct taped to my mailbox. "Unauthorized livestock activity. Fine, $500. I stared at it, then looked at my cows, who were lazily chewing cud well inside the boundary line. I pulled out my phone and checked the surveyor's GPS map again. I was right. They were lying. I walked over to the corner stake, and that's when I saw it. The property marker, bright orange, steel rod was pulled halfway out of the dirt and shoved back in at a new angle, 3 feet inward. "Unbelievable," I muttered. I knew Perla hated my cows, but falsifying boundary lines to fine me. That was criminal, so I set up motion-activated trail cams around the perimeter. Hidden well, high-res, night vision, and I waited. Perla had just picked the wrong rancher to mess with. 3 nights later, I got what I needed. I waited until just after midnight when the pasture was quiet and the only sound was the low hum of cicadas. My trail cams had motion sensors, and the footage came straight to my phone. At 12:43 in the morning, it buzzed. I tapped into the live feed and saw 2 figures by the corner stake, one holding a flashlight, the other crouched low with something metallic in hand, Perla and her vice president, Greg Tully. Greg wore khakis like he was going golfing, not committing felony trespass. Perla held the flashlight steady while he yanked the boundary marker out and hammered it a full yard deeper into my property using a small mallet. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. This clearly wasn't the first time. I didn't call the sheriff that night. I wanted more than a trespassing charge. I wanted them nailed on property tampering, fraud, and abuse of authority. I needed their intentions captured, not just their footprints. So the next morning, I went to the county recorder's office and pulled every plat map dating back to the original Broken Maple Estates development filing. The old maps didn't lie. That fence line. My grandfather put it up 38 years ago, right along the surveyed boundary. It hadn't moved an inch. The HOA had never owned a square foot of that corner. Ever. I cross-referenced the GPS coordinates from my surveyor's digital log and overlaid them on the county files. It matched perfectly. Perla's new green space claim wasn't just wrong, it was fabricated. By that evening, I had a full dossier, video evidence, time-stamped footage, GPS overlays, historical plats, and an affidavit from my surveyor confirming the markers had been tampered with. I brought it all to a friend of mine, Reed Thomas, who just retired as a district court judge and now taught municipal law at the community college. I laid it all out on his kitchen table. He adjusted his glasses as he flipped through the folder. They moved the marker by hand, caught them red-handed. He nodded slowly, tapping the edge of a photo. "This isn't just trespassing. This falls under falsifying property boundaries. That's a felony in this county." And if they issued a fine based on this lie, that's wire fraud if it crossed state lines and mail fraud if sent through the post. I leaned back in the chair. Think the sheriff will take it seriously? Reed looked up. With this. They'll have no choice. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office. I handed over the entire packet. The deputy at the front desk raised an eyebrow at the video stills but didn't say much. Just nodded, took my statement, and told me a detective would be in touch. That afternoon, Perla rolled past my pasture in her white Lexus, slowing just enough to narrow her eyes at me before speeding up again. She had no idea the bomb was about to drop. The detective, Marla DeWitt, called me 3 days later. Her tone was clipped professional. I reviewed everything you sent. We also pulled HOA communications through a subpoena. Turns out they've been planning to reclassify that strip of land for months, even discussed how to force compliance in board emails. They admitted it, in not so many words. But there's enough to suggest intent. We're opening a criminal investigation into tampering with a survey marker and attempting to defraud a homeowner. The next day, 2 county cruisers pulled up in front of Perla's house. I didn't watch out of some desire for spectacle. I watched to make sure it wasn't swept under the rug. Greg Tully was handcuffed first. Perla followed, arms crossed, refusing to look at anyone. I didn't celebrate. I called a community meeting. We held it in my barn, of all places. I strung up some lights, set out folding chairs, and brewed a few dozen gallons of sweet tea. People came. Not just the folks from my end of the development, but newer families, 2 people who hadn't yet learned what kind of machine the HOA had become. I stood at the front with a projector screen and clicked through the evidence. The crowd was silent, save for a few quiet gasps when I showed the footage of Perla and Greg shifting the boundary marker. Every fine they issued, I said, based on this fabricated map, is invalid. And if it happened to me, it can happen to any of you. A man in the back stood up, Todd, a plumber who just moved in last year. They fined me $700 for putting up a swing set, said it was over the setback line. I didn't fight it. They've been doing this for years, said Mrs. Gladwell, one of the neighborhood's original homeowners. They fined me for trimming a tree, my tree. I looked around at the crowd. We've got 2 choices. We can wait for the county to finish the investigation, or we can demand change now. We can vote to suspend the board under Emergency Provision B17 of the bylaws. A woman near the front raised her hand. Is that even legal? I checked with a lawyer. We need 35% of homeowners to sign the petition. That triggers a vote to suspend all current officers pending investigation, and with everything we've uncovered, the county won't challenge it. The signatures came fast. People were angry, and more than that, they were embarrassed. They trusted Perla and her board, and now they saw what that trust had cost them. By the end of the week, we had double the required signatures. We held the vote in the community center auditorium. Perla wasn't there. Greg wasn't either. Only one board member showed up, Linda, the treasurer, who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. The vote was unanimous. The board was suspended, and a provisional committee was formed to handle operations until elections could be held. I didn't run. I didn't want the job. But I made sure every person on that committee had one thing in common. They'd all been fined unfairly by Perla's regime. The very next day, we sent out a community-wide notice. All outstanding fines issued in the last year were frozen pending legal review. Any liens placed by the HOA were being challenged in court. 1 week later, I got a letter from the county prosecutor's office. Perla and Greg had been formally charged with falsifying property records and abuse of fiduciary duty. It was over. But not really. Because now, the community wasn't afraid anymore. People started painting their mailboxes again, planting what they wanted in their yards, repairing fences without permission slips. And no one from the HOA came knocking. As for me, I replaced the corner marker with a 10-foot steel post sunk 3 feet in concrete, surrounded by a ring of solar-powered floodlights. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted every visitor to know where my land began and where their rule ended. The week after the board was suspended, I thought things might finally settle. But then I got a call from Detective DeWitt again, and her tone wasn't the usual clipped professionalism. It was urgent. There's something else, she said. We executed a warrant for HOA board communications stored on a third-party server. One of the digital forensic analysts found an access log to a private drive Perla used. That's where it gets worse. Worse than property tampering, I asked. Much worse. We've found falsified billing records, dozens of them. Looks like the HOA's been siphoning money from resident fines and depositing them into what appears to be a private account registered under a shell LLC. I didn't say anything for a moment. The silence on the line was heavy. They've been stealing from the community. Not just that. There are records showing Perla and Greg approved payments to contractors who don't exist. Thousands of dollars in maintenance fees for work that was never done. We're talking about potential embezzlement north of $200,000, I exhaled slowly. So they weren't just power hungry, they were running a full-on racket. The DA's office is preparing charges, she said, but the fraud unit wants to know if you'd be willing to make a statement. You're listed as the first resident who documented boundary manipulation, and they're treating that as the initial trigger of the larger investigation. I agreed. 2 days later, I sat in a room with a state fraud investigator, a recorder on the table between us, and laid out everything from the first bogus fine to the night I caught them moving the stake. When I told them about the barn permit Perla claimed she never received despite the stamped approval from the county, they took note. Turns out, she'd been intercepting mail from the county zoning office. Anything that might contradict her narrative, she redirected. She had a friend in the postal sorting facility, apparently. That person's name came up in the investigation too. By the following Monday, the HOA's official bank accounts were frozen. The temporary committee had to rely on donations and volunteer labor to keep basic services running. But no one seemed to mind. The community rallied people, trimmed common areas themselves, fixed up benches, and took turns mowing the park. It felt like a neighborhood again. Then something unexpected happened. Linda, the former treasurer, the only board member who hadn't been arrested, showed up at my shop one afternoon. She waited until I finished replacing a brake line on an old Ford pickup, then followed me back to the front desk. I need to talk, she said. Off the record. I eyed her. Only if you're not here to spin things. I'm not, she said. I'm here to come clean. She sat across from me, shoulders tense, voice low. I didn't know the full scale of what Perla and Greg were doing. I suspected something, but every time I asked about the books, I was told I didn't need to worry about it. Focus on treasury logistics, they said. I wasn't allowed access to the full ledger, only what they printed for me. You signed off on payments, I replied. Your name's on the checks. They gave me scanned copies with forged invoices already attached. I thought it was legit. When I finally pushed back, Greg said they'd reassign me if I kept asking questions. I leaned back. Why are you telling me this now? Because the state's coming after everyone, and I figure if I'm honest, maybe I can avoid going down with them. I've already spoken to the fraud unit, gave them everything I had. You willing to testify? She nodded. Yes, and I've got records. I started saving things on a flash drive months ago, emails, chat logs, even a few voicemail recordings Perla left me. That was the break prosecutors needed. With Linda's cooperation, the case snowballed. The forensic team cross-referenced her files with the HOA's official logs and started connecting dots no one had seen before. Turns out, Perla had been operating this scheme for years. She used fake vendor names, some borrowed from real businesses, others completely fabricated to move money. She'd even created false service requests for things like drainage system evaluations and pest control audits. The funds were funneled through an LLC registered in Nevada, then moved again to a personal account in Florida. They charged her with wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and obstruction of a government process. Greg got hit with aiding and abetting, criminal conspiracy, and falsifying land survey documentation. The postal facility contact was picked up separately for tampering with federal mail. When the trial began, it wasn't a local affair, it got picked up by regional news. A suburban HOA president indicted on multiple felony charges. It made headlines. They even interviewed residents on the courthouse steps. The prosecution used my footage, Linda's documents, and statements from other homeowners who'd paid outrageous fines for infractions that were either fabricated or wildly exaggerated. One man had been charged over $2,000 for unauthorized tree removal. He'd only trimmed a limb that was threatening to fall on his garage. The jury didn't take long. Perla was found guilty on all counts. Greg folded halfway through the trial, offered a plea deal in exchange for testimony about the shell companies and the fake vendor accounts. Both were sentenced to prison. Perla for 12 years, Greg for 7. With the criminal side wrapped up, the residents turned their attention to rebuilding. The temporary committee held new elections, and the turnout was triple what it had ever been before. People who'd never bothered to attend a meeting now packed the rec center, ready to vote for candidates they actually knew. No one ran unopposed. Every seat was contested. That was new. The new board included a retired accountant named Darlene, who caught a discrepancy in the HOA's annual water usage report her first week in office. She traced it back to a leaking irrigation line no one had ever bothered to fix. Saved the community over $5,000 a year. We also appointed a liaison to work directly with the county to ensure all future zoning decisions, permit approvals, and landscaping ordinances were centralized and stored digitally with open access for residents. Transparency became the new standard. And me. I got invited to speak at a municipal oversight conference 2 months later. They wanted to hear how a small-town mechanic with a few cows exposed one of the most elaborate HOA scams in the state. I didn't go for the recognition. I went because they needed to hear one thing: power hoarded is power abused. Don't let a title on a clipboard become a license to steal. I got a standing ovation. Back home, the pasture was quiet again. The cows stayed where they belonged. The new boundary post, now surrounded by a small flower bed someone from the garden club planted as a thank you. No one called the cops on livestock anymore. But just in case, I left the trail cams up. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew better than to take peace for granted. 2 months after the trial, the newly elected board had already begun cleaning up the mess Perla left behind. But then an envelope showed up in my mailbox, no return address, just my name in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of an old HOA purchase order dated 5 years earlier, listing a perimeter security upgrade billed at $58,000. The problem? There were no security upgrades installed in Broken Maple Estates. No cameras, no fences. No new lighting. Nothing. I brought the document to Darlene, the new treasurer, at one of the board's open office days. She squinted at the heading, then pulled out a decade's worth of scan budgets stored on a flash drive. "There's no record of this anywhere in the official books," she said, dragging the file into a comparison tool. "This vendor isn't listed in any year's expenses, but that amount. That's the exact figure the previous board claimed as a reserve fund allocation in 2019. So they buried it under a fake improvement project. Looks like it. And if they claimed a capital expenditure but pocketed the money, that's misappropriation. If they laundered it through a fake vendor, that's federal." I leaned on the edge of her desk. "And if that vendor's fake, they had to create tax records to match." Darlene nodded. "Unless they skipped that part, in which case the IRS is going to want to know why $58,000 in disbursements vanished with no tax reporting." She reached for her phone. An audit team from the state's Department of Charitable Organizations and Homeowners Associations arrived 5 days later. They set up a temporary workspace inside the old HOA office, now stripped of Perla's framed mission statements and decorative gavel. Their team brought laptops, scanners, and a forensic accountant named Victor who wore round glasses and never looked up from his screen. By the end of the first week, they'd uncovered 12 separate transactions routed through 4 different shell companies, each supposedly tied to infrastructure upgrades. One had an address that turned out to be a closed-down laundromat. Another was registered to a mailbox inside a UPS store 3 counties over. What made it worse was that these transactions were signed off by more than just Perla and Greg. A third name appeared, a man named Barry Kincaid, listed as HOA legal counsel in several documents. Barry had never attended board meetings. No one in the neighborhood had ever seen him, but his signature appeared on multiple HOA resolutions. Darlene tracked down his bar number through the state legal directory and discovered it had been suspended over 6 years ago. He wasn't a practicing attorney. He wasn't even a resident. He was Perla's cousin. Detective DeWitt returned to the neighborhood shortly after. This time, she wore plain clothes and carried a slim black briefcase. She met with me, Darlene, and the new board president, Emilio, inside the converted community center where we'd held the elections. "This is bigger than we thought," she said, laying out a new string of documents. Kincaid was involved in similar schemes in 2 other HOA cases under different aliases. He used expired credentials to pose as legal counsel, drafted fake vendor contracts, and signed off on phony improvement projects. Emilio folded his arms. So Perla brought in her cousin as a fake lawyer to rubber stamp the theft. That's the working theory. The state ag's office is building a consolidated case. They're calling it organized property fraud. Your HOA is one of 3 named in the complaint. Kincaid's already been arrested in Nevada. I studied the documents. Can we be sure he didn't access any resident bank information? We found no evidence of that, but the deeper issue is the reserve funds. Those accounts were drained, and in some cases, loans were taken out in the HOA's name with forged board votes. Darlene's eyes widened. Loans? What kind of loans? Construction loans from a private lender in Dallas. Perla used forged meeting minutes to authorize them. The lender is now trying to collect on over $120,000 with interest. Emilio shook his head. That debt wasn't authorized by the community. DeWitt nodded. Which is why the AG is filing an injunction to freeze collection until the case is resolved. But you've got a long road ahead. The board voted unanimously to file a civil suit against Perla, Greg, and Kincaid for damages. They also petitioned the county to remove the HOA's legal standing and convert the community into a non-HOA neighborhood, governed by voluntary association only. This wasn't a casual request. It required a majority of all property owners and an appeal to the county supervisor. But people were ready. The fraud, the deception, the threats, it had all been too much. The petition took 2 weeks to gather, and we submitted it with over 70% of homeowners' signatures. The county held a hearing in a packed chamber. Emilio and Darlene presented the evidence. I spoke last. I told them how this all started, how 3 feet of cow pasture turned into a criminal conspiracy. How the people trusted to protect property values instead tried to steal property itself. The county voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA's charter. Broken Maple Estates became just Maple Estates, no board, no fines, no secret meetings. Just neighbors. People pitched in to maintain the common areas, and a volunteer committee rotated monthly to handle things like park cleanup and seasonal decorations. The old HOA office was converted into a lending library and tool exchange, funded by small donations, and a bake sale that somehow raised over $4,000. Darlene joked that the brownies did more to unite the neighborhood than any board had. The cows. They roamed as they pleased, always within the fence line, always a little smug in their own way. One of the kids painted a mural on the side of my barn. It showed a cartoon cow wearing sunglasses standing over a clipboard labeled "Invalid Fine." I left it there. A month later, Emilio stopped by my shop with a manila envelope. Inside was a letter from the state ag's office. Perla and Greg had accepted plea deals. Perla would serve 15 years in a federal facility. Greg got 8. Kincaid's case was still pending, but the ag's office was confident. Restitution was being ordered. The stolen funds would be repaid through asset liquidation. Perla's lake house, Greg's investment condo in Phoenix, Kincaid's offshore account, all seized. The funds would be distributed back to affected residents. We held a community cookout to mark the end of it all. Not a celebration, more like a collective exhale. People brought lawn chairs and dishes, and someone set up a projector to screen an old western against the side of my barn. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Emilio raised a glass of lemonade. "No more fear," he said. "No more fines, and no more fences pretending to be law." The crowd clapped. Not wild applause, just the steady rhythm of people who'd reclaimed something important. When the projector flickered to life, I stood at the edge of the field, watching the cows graze under the glow of dusk. The new boundary marker, a polished steel post with a carved plaque reading "Community Begins Here," stood firm, and this time no one dared move it.